Hello all. Welcome to week 2 of the class. This week we're going through chapter 11, 12, and 15. This particular lecture we will be going through chapter 11. Again, reminder, we've got no lab this week. So up on my screen, I've got shared just a simple Word document that I've kind of created. Once we start doing our skills, I will give everybody a binder, and in that binder, it's got some different handout information, medication lists that you're responsible, and something very similar to this. The sheet that I hand out is the National Registry Standard sheet, and it can be a little hard to read through and understand exactly what's wanted of you with it. So this is a simplified version, and you can find this on your Schoology page as well under Final Skills Testing. My version of it is located there. Otherwise, if you want a copy of the National Registry version prior to our lab meeting up, our lab day, you can just go ahead and Google National Registry EMT medical assessment and it'll show up. Like I said, it's a standardized sheet. So what this is basically a list A to Z of everything that you need to do for your assessment. Simplified, which is just a little bit easier to follow. EMR is the lowest level of EMS education, and it's around the lowest level of medical education in general, right? CNA and EMR are very similar as far as like the hierarchy of knowledge. So the good thing is that this is entry-level medical assessment, regardless of whether or not you have any sort of medical knowledge, or if you know a lot. This medical assessment is really good, it's thorough, and it's pretty straightforward. The other nice thing is that I noticed a lot of you are planning on going through nursing or medical school. This assessment is very similar to a lot of the further like medical assessments. A lot of the same things that we talk about, like sample and OPQRST and DCAT BTLS, are things that are used in other medical assessments, whether it's nursing or doctors or PAs or whatnot. Same thing with AVPU and GCS. Those are all across the board used in the medical world. So regardless of what you want to do to further your career, this is a wonderful place to start. So the first section here, I'm just going to highlight it. This first section is called Scene Size Up, and that's where this first chapter 11 is focused. These are the 6 different steps of the Scene Size Up, and our lecture today is going to go a little bit deeper into what in the world these mean. Like, what is an MOI? What is an NOI? So it'll go a little bit deeper into this, and I'll kind of tell you as to why this is where we start. Subsequent chapters this week are going to talk about the primary assessment. That's this whole section here. Again, kind of going through things top to bottom. And I believe we're going through secondary assessment today as well. So that goes into a little bit more like history taking, vital signs, etc. Reassessment is next week, week 3, I believe. So one question I do get, and this tends to be from people that do have medical experience. So if you've been an EMT before, or if you've been an EMS driver for an extended period of time and you have a general idea of how patient assessments work, it can be really frustrating to go back to this idea of having to verbalize everything. So when we are doing our medical assessments, when we're learning how to do our medical assessments, and when we're testing at the National Registry level, we have to verbalize everything. So PPE, my scene is safe. The mechanism of injury is this. I have this many patients. It can get a bit frustrating to those of you that have already been in the field, because you just do it automatically, right? You don't even think about it. You just look around your scene. It's really easy to tell that, hey, I've got one patient, or this is what's going on. But you have to be able to slow yourself down a little bit and actually start verbalizing those things. So I get it's really frustrating as somebody that knows what's going on, or has been doing this in the field, kind of coming back to it and having to start verbalizing things can be difficult. Another thing I've had students run into before that they find is frustrating, is if they've already worked in the field, is that, whoops, I'm messing up the formatting here. During the primary assessment, oftentimes in the real world, we're working with partners. So maybe I'm doing the primary assessment while my partner is starting to get vital signs. Well, vital signs isn't technically until the secondary assessment. So when we're learning this for the National Registry, you're learning it for the first time. It can be a bit confusing as to why we're not doing those things right away. Why aren't we taking vital signs first? Well, the way that education or this particular side of education works is it's assuming that you're by yourself because everyone needs to know in what order things need to get done so that when you do start adding in partners, whether it's one partner or two partners, you know what order things need to happen. So regardless of what is going on with the patient, airway is always more important than getting vital signs. So if you get on scene and airway isn't good, that needs to happen or needs to be managed before you start getting vital signs or before you start asking history questions, things like that. And like I said, we'll go through it a little bit more in depth today in those lectures. And then this isn't something that's leaving. We introduce it really early in this class, and then we practice it throughout the rest of the duration of class. So the sooner you do get this memorized and understand the different steps, the better off you're going to be in this class, especially when we start doing things like scenarios. All right, I'm just going to exit out of this here quick, and then I'll get this pulled up. Scene size up, this chapter 11 is actually pretty quick time-wise. And as I mentioned before, it starts with scene size up. So what is scene size up? Well, it's taking our standard precautions. It's putting on those masks, the gloves, gowns if we have time, glasses or safety eye shields. We also want to look at mechanism of injury or nature of the patient's illnesses, determining how many patients we have, determining whether or not we need additional resources. For instance, if we have 6 patients on scene, we're going to need a lot more than just one ambulance, right? And then determining whether or not our patients need a C-collar. And this is determining need for C-collar, not necessarily putting a C-collar on. So here we're stopping and holding physical C-spine on the patient. We're not necessarily placing a C-collar at this point. So scene safety. The only predictable thing about emergencies is that they're often unpredictable. There are a lot of different things that can pose quote unquote dangers within EMS because we're not working in a controlled environment. And dangers, I mean, oftentimes when we say danger, our mind immediately goes to like the extremes, the gunshots, the stabbing, those types of things. But I like to call it more of a hazard. So it could be anything like there's an icy driveway that maybe if we step out of the ambulance too quickly, we might lose our footing and slip on the ice and get hurt, right? Or it might be something like there are 4 steps leading up to the front door. That's not necessarily a hazard per se, but it does complicate how we're going to get our patient out of the house and into the ambulance that's going to be transporting them, right? Things like animals in the yard we want to look for. I'd mentioned this in the last week's lectures, but I love dogs. Dogs are amazing, but dogs can be really unpredictable when it comes to strangers. So even a dog tied up in the yard is a bit of a hazard. We want to make sure that we're being cautious in those situations. Scene safety starts from pretty much the minute we get a 911 call. As we're driving to the scene of an accident or to the scene of a medical emergency, we want to look and listen for any other emergency units approaching. So oftentimes we are not the only ones going to 911s, especially if it's something like a car accident. Usually fire departments as well as any law enforcement in the area are also responding. And keep in mind that law enforcement might not just be like the city cops, they also might be county or state patrol that are going to those scenes of accidents. So there might be a lot of different agents responding, and you're all going to the same place, so odds are you're going to cross paths with each other, and we want to make sure that we're not running into any of our fellow emergency vehicles. If we are going to site of a collision, we want to look for any sort of power outage. Say if somebody hit a utility pole, we want to make sure that we're being safe around those and getting electrical flow shut off. Observing traffic, if it is an incident, What's the flow of traffic like? Is traffic stopped? Are people speeding past the accident? Do we need to control traffic? Is that our job? Typically not. Usually fire departments are the ones that are going to be controlling that traffic flow. When we're within sight of the scene, we want to look for any sort of hazards, like I mentioned, like steps, or in this case, maybe hazardous materials. Um, Maybe it's something where like you're getting called to a high school football game. Well, there's a lot of cars there and there's a lot of people there. Um, those can be potentially problematic as well. Again, not that we're not going to go into the scene, but it's something to take note of and know that you may have to react accordingly in those situations. Like if there's a lot of cars there, where are you going to park? How close can you get to your patient? Are you going to have to walk a ways? If there's a lot of people around, you're going to have people filming and other people wanting to get way too close to the patient and things like that can kind of jeopardize how safe you and your patient are within that scene. I used to work in downtown La Crosse, Wisconsin. Um, for those of you that don't know, it is a huge drinking town. And working downtown La Crosse, especially on the weekends, we tended to be very busy. People would pass out just on the street or on the sidewalks. So we'd go do our thing. But as soon as you looked up from your patient, you realized, you were surrounded by people. They were all drinking or had all been drinking or, had their cameras out and so on and so forth. And oftentimes it ended up being kind of an interesting scene. More often than not, everything was fine and it wasn't an issue, but it definitely could have gotten aggressive pretty quickly. So just need to be aware of it. Oftentimes law enforcement beats us to the scene if they are responding. I don't know what it is. I think they must just drive really fast, but they usually make it to the scene a little bit faster than we do. So when we do get within sight of that scene, if you do see law enforcement there, we try not to block them in. They try not to block us in. Usually law enforcement won't park in driveways, and more often than not, we will if we have the opportunity to. It's kind of an unwritten thing, at least in this area, in my experience. But try not to block them in or anything like that. When you get on a scene, there's going to be someone that's in charge. It may be if you're the only first responder group that's getting to scene, there's going to be somebody in your crew that's in charge. It might be you, it might be somebody else. Typically, it's going to be the one that has the highest seniority. But when you're new, sometimes they like to throw you in as well and say, hey, this is your call. You're the one that's going to be talking to the patient and directing the scene, right? In those situations, you need to make sure that you're giving directions. But if you're not in charge, make sure that you're being a good follower and listening and understanding the directions that are being given to you. Make sure that you've got your appropriate PPE on. Also, when you're outside of the scene, make sure that you're smelling for any odors that might indicate hazardous materials. Things like gas or fuel have a pretty potent smell. So at this point in my in-person lectures, typically I'll open it up to students and say, what do you see about this scene? What are the different hazards that you see about this scene? So if you want to pause the video for a second or do whatever you need to do, just to kind of take a look at this scene and come up with some different hazards. All right, so assuming you either pause the video or just were doing it in the time that it took me to take a sip of my Dr. Pepper right there, we'll kind of go through this together. So this obviously is like a trailer home. Absolutely nothing against people who live in trailer homes, nothing against trailer homes. I don't mean to be offensive in any way, shape, or form, but I am going to state a few things that I've found to be facts. Trailer homes typically have very narrow passageways, whether it's to back bedrooms or very small bathrooms. Everything is just a little bit more compact. That's kind of the whole point of a trailer home, right? Because it's just a little bit more compact. So anytime we have patients that are on the ground, it poses complications right away to being able to pick them up and get them maneuvered in the right way. So safety issues right there, right? It might be hard to get patients up on their feet or onto our cots. Honestly, looking at this house, we're probably not even able to get our cot into the house. There are a few steps there. Remember last week when I mentioned that our cots weigh about 150 to 200 pounds without anybody on them? It's absolutely true, and they're very top heavy, so we don't like to go up any sort of steps, whether it's 1 step or 12 steps. We don't like to take the cot up any steps. So for something like this, right away, I'm starting to think I might need a stair chair to be able to get in, not only into this trailer, but also to maneuver around. Oftentimes, our cots don't really fit well inside of trailers, just in general. I'm looking around, it looks like it's winter in this picture. So if our patient is outside, we need to be worried about things like hypothermia, or a patient's too cold. I'm also seeing that it looks like there's some snow on their deck and their steps. That might mean that there's ice underneath, or it might be a little slippery when we're walking up those steps. There's also some miscellaneous things in the yard. It looks like some chairs over here, maybe some fencing over here. That can maybe pose a little bit of a hazard to us as we're walking down those stairs. If we do slip, we might fall into something. Also, my personal experience is that the dirtier the yard is, the more likely it is to be cluttered on the inside of the home as well. I'm making some general broad kind of statements here. Obviously, I know that's not always true, but if I were to walk up to a scene like this, I would start to think that maybe the inside of the trailer is rather cluttered. So again, that's leading me to think I'm going to use a stair chair, which is more compact, as opposed to my cot to get to this patient. So those are just a few things kind of looking at this that come to my mind right away. Perhaps there are other things that you noticed as well. So this chapter specifically is kind of talking about vehicle crashes and scene safety around vehicles. My big point here is that it doesn't have to be just vehicle collisions that we're looking at our scene safety. It really is every single call that we go into, and there's a lot of different hazards, right? Car accidents do bring a few different types of hazards to us. Things like wreckage of vehicles is big. You'll have things like broken glass, broken bumpers, tire pieces all over the place, right? Things like that, just from the wreckage itself. We do want to be very careful in those situations. Also, they can leak fluids, so the ground might be really slick. And if we're working on a roadway, we need to make sure that we're wearing high visibility tearaway vests, safety vests. Those are required to be in every ambulance, so you'll have access to those. So we want to put those on, and that's a DOT standard. When a vehicle is on fire, we want to be at least 100 feet away in all directions. Again, we are not firefighters, or at least this class is not training you to be a firefighter. So if you have any additional fire training, that's wonderful. Note that for EMS, that is not our repertoire. So we want to make sure that we're back far enough that the firefighters can do their thing, right? If there's any sort of hazardous materials involved, we can look at our ERG book, or our emergency response guidebook, and try and determine what those hazards are. I think I mentioned this last week as well, but the ERG will have its own kind of chapter towards the end of class that we'll go through. And yeah, we'll go through it in a little bit more depth. Note that it does give generalized treatments. So if you happen to run into XYZ, these are the treatments that you may need to use for your patients, or these are the symptoms that are most likely to appear with these patients. Crime scenes and active violence, evaluating for threat of violence, things like loud voices, weapons that are visible, signs of alcohol or drug use, unusual silence, and knowledge of prior violence all kind of come into play with this. Again, these are fairly broad. They may indicate a higher threat of violence. It's not that every time signs of alcohol are there means that your patient's going to be violent, right? Same thing with weapons that are visible. We live in rural Wisconsin for the most part, right? Everybody and their brother owns a hunting rifle and probably a few handguns or whatnot. If you see them around when you go into the call, just be aware, right? If it's something where the patient's holding it, then it's a little bit different story. But if it's, say, in a gun cabinet or leaning up against a chair or something like that, then it's just a little bit different. So, if it bothers you, either just leave the scene completely or call law enforcement or have maybe have the patient leave that area and go into the ambulance or something like that, right? Prior knowledge of violence. In those situations, say the cops were called to that location for that patient 5 weeks ago, they started hitting the cops, violence. Oftentimes they will flag that address or that patient's name or that person's name. And if we get any other calls for that person, it will automatically come up in our dispatch that says, hey, so-and-so has been flagged for violence. Law enforcement is going to be on scene with you. Dispatch is getting really good at that, actually. So standard precautions, we've got our scene safety, our standard precautions. We also call these body substance isolations. We use them pretty synonymously in EMS. So I've had a lot of students come through and they've worked in the food industry and they're like, no, it's always PPE. That's fine. It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't really matter the National Registry. Just know that those two terms are used for standard precautions. So once we have all of our PPE on, then we'll start looking at the nature of the call, determining why EMS has been called. What happened? Why are we called? Is it a fall? Is it a medical reason? And then looking a little bit farther into that. So in EMS, we divide our calls into two different sections. Actually, technically it'd be three, but basically two different sections. A mechanism of injury, like they were punched in the face, and a nature of illness, like they have pneumonia. And then the third one would be they have both. Like they were driving their car when they had a stroke, so they got into a car accident type situations, which we won't talk about a ton in this class because we try to keep things as straightforward as possible. So mechanism of injury, this is the force that may have caused the injury. Sorry about that. Force that may have caused the injury, understanding those forces and predicting those patterns. So if they get punched in the face, what type of injuries are we expecting? Well, we're going to expect, facial trauma. We're not going to expect that there's going to be injuries to the foot or the ankle, right? So if we look at this car, if we look at this picture, what are some types of injuries that we may be expecting to see with our patient? I'll let you think on that for just a second, or you can pause the video. The thing with this one is pretty much anything, right? It's a bad enough car accident that there's a ton that could be going wrong with the patient in this. A windshield being that damaged, or even the roof of the car being that damaged. It could be pretty much anything. It could be, a patient walking away with nothing because they were intoxicated and they were just all loosey-goosey the entire time that this trauma was happening. Or it could be a fatality, right? There's really no way of knowing. But that's all about what determining that mechanism of injury is about, is trying to figure out what types of injuries you might be seeing before you even get eyes on the patient. There's a few different types of motor vehicle collisions, and based on the type of collision can determine what type of injury pattern you might see. So head-on collisions, you can get an up and over injury pattern or a down and under injury pattern. So if somebody got thrown up and over the top versus underneath the ambulance or underneath the vehicle, you'll see at different types of injuries, right? Clues such as the airbag being deployed might give us kind of indication that there's going to be, some head trauma, maybe some neck trauma, even some chest trauma involvement. Same thing if there's any sort of starring or these spider web cracks on the windshield. That's a pretty good indication that there's going to be some head trauma involved. That's a pretty good picture about the spidering on the windshield or starring on the windshield. You can also have collisions like rear end collisions. Of course, you're getting hit in the back end. Side impact or T-bone broadside collisions or rollover collisions. All of them offer up a different type of injury pattern that you might be suspecting to see. So this one, there's a ton of intrusion to the back of this car. Odds are there's probably not any survivors with something like this if they got smucked that hard. Maybe the people in the front seat are okay-ish, but my guess is you're not going to see a lot of patients from that type of injury. Same thing with this. It'd be nice if they kind of put some different images, and in fact, I might do that and edit these slides a bit and put some less crazy car accidents in here. But something like this, again, this is probably a fatal accident. That's on the driver's side. There's so much intrusion into that vehicle space that my guess is they didn't have much of a patient left to treat. All right, so something like this, a rollover incident. I've seen rollovers where the patients are completely dead and crunchy when you touch them. And then I've had rollovers where the car looks absolutely horrible. You walk up going like, yeah, this is going to be a fatality. There's no way. And then the patient's absolutely fine. I've had two like that, actually, where the car looked horrible. Both times the patient was under some sort of influence. The first one, it was alcohol. The second one, it was they were huffing duster, I think. Rotational impacts, cars are struck and then they spin. This kind of offers the opportunity to have a lot of different types of injuries because they're spinning and getting hit from all directions. Oh, excuse me. Falls are a big part of EMS trauma. In fact, they make up a good chunk of the trauma that we see, especially elderly and adult falls. It's considered significant if an adult falls more than 20 feet, or if a child falls more than 10 feet or 3 times their height. That being said, you start getting elderly patients that fall from standing and they break their hip, right? So it really depends on a lot of things in the situation. If it was a younger person that's healthy and fit and doesn't have any sort of deterioration to their body and they fall from standing, then they're probably going to be okay. Maybe a broken wrist or something like that. If they fall from 20 feet, there's a significant amount of force in that fall, and there's going to be probably some substantial injuries that are happening versus somebody that's maybe already broken those bones before or has some deterioration with their bone density and stuff. Those more elderly patients, when they fall from standing, it's quite possible that they have some really bad injuries. So if we're looking at a picture like this, again, you could pause the video to kind of see what you might think the mechanism of injury is, what different hazards you notice in this scene as well. So feel free to pause. I'm going to take another sip of my drink. All right, so in this one, obviously we can see that the patient is laying on their back, kind of at a weird angle. Their arms are kind of bent at different angles. That leg looks like it's bent kind of weird. So it's quite possible, just looking at this patient, that they're unresponsive and they've got some broken bones happening here. Obviously, they're at some sort of construction site. This patient does not appear to be wearing a helmet, and that's usually something that on commercial construction sites, at least, they're very strict on. So my question is, where's the helmet? Did it get knocked off, or was he not wearing one at all? Leads me to think that there might be some sort of head trauma involved in this. It's possible that it looks like there's a 2-story structure here. It's possible that they fell off that 2-story structure. That's not good, right? Like, that's pretty significant. Or it's possible that they tripped over these 2x4s and just fell on the ground and now they're being all dramatic, right? It could be anything, but those are the things that talk to me right away. The other thing here is looking at our scene safety. He's got quite a lot of tools on his tool belt there. I can't tell exactly what they are, but I know that getting stabbed by a screwdriver doesn't feel very good. So I would probably recommend that that patient takes off that tool belt, doesn't take it to the hospital, doesn't even bring it into the ambulance. And honestly, even if we could take the tools out right away or take the belt off right away so that if the patient does become agitated or altered, we're not getting hurt by that equipment. Talking about scene safety as well, we want to make sure that we are safe entering into this construction zone. So if they do have any large equipment that's being operated, making sure that that's not going to interfere with our ability to talk to the patient or our safety. Turning it off or making sure that it's far away is nice. So important factors for falls: the height of the fall, what did they fall onto, what part of the patient hit the surface, and then did anything interrupt that fall. So interrupting the fall meaning like, okay, they fell off the ceiling, but or fell off the roof, but they hit a tree on their way down. That changes that injury pattern a bit. Penetrating trauma is injuries caused by objects that pass through the skin, any sort of punctures that happen, classified by the velocity. So you can have high velocity, low velocity, and mid velocity. So low velocity would be things like knife injuries. Typically, the damage is going to be pretty well isolated to one specific area. However, there might be multiple wounds. Oftentimes when people get stabbed, the stabber draws back and then stabs again. Medium velocity would be things like a handgun, and then high velocity would be things like a rifle, where injuries may be anywhere in the body. So a lot of that, you start looking and taking into consideration the ballistics, what type of ammunition were they using, what type of handgun was it, how far away was the patient when they were shot. All of those things come into play when you start dealing with those high and mid velocity weapons. It's very interesting stuff. I've done a little bit of research into it. I would love to know more, but it's something you can definitely go down the rabbit hole when getting into ballistics. Note that when you do have mid velocity and high velocity, that the damage to the patient's body can be really anywhere. You can have an entrance wound in the chest and an exit wound in the thigh and a whole bunch of damage in between, right? It really just depends on the ballistics. Blunt force trauma is any sort of trauma that happens that does not penetrate the skin. So like a punch to the face where there's not like an open cut, that would be a blunt force trauma. I don't know what's up with me and getting punched in the face today. I'm using that example a lot. Nature of illness, this is looking at the medical side of patients calling. So we start to kind of look into, okay, what was the dispatch information? Oftentimes, in fact, this just happened yesterday. We get called for unknown medical. The dispatchers, at least in Crawford County, love to use that, unknown medical. And what that means is the patient's telling them a whole bunch of symptoms, or law enforcement's telling them a whole bunch of symptoms. The dispatcher has no idea. They just know that it's something medical. It's not trauma related, so they'll dispatch us out like that. Other times patients will call in and they'll say, oh my gosh, I think I'm having a heart attack. So that's what we get dispatched out for, is possible heart attack. So we want to look for patients, even like most of the time we're assuming that we just have one, but it's always a good idea to double check. When you do go into a scene, just verify, like, okay, you're the only one that's injured today, especially with those trauma situations. It's also quite possible that if it is a trauma, like a car accident or a bike accident, that there were several people involved. So we just want to verify how many patients we have. With any sort of scene, whether it's trauma or medical, we also want to gather information from the patient first, typically, but then if we're kind of missing information, we're going to talk to family members, we're going to talk to bystanders, and then we're going to look at the scene as well and see kind of what's going on with the scene. Like if you see a whole bunch of skid marks on the road, you can just imagine that they slammed on their brakes and they slid for a while. All of those things can tell you about injury patterns. Number of patients and adequacy of resources. So you kind of start to ask yourself, okay, how many patients are here? What type of injuries do they have? And are we capable of dealing with these patients, or do we need to call additional resources? So right away, if you've got a car accident, you're going to call law enforcement and fire department. Honestly, dispatch is probably going to do it for you. They may even call additional ambulances if the caller says right away that, hey, there's 5 patients here, right? They might just call additional resources for you. Other times you might get on scene and realize, okay, there's 2 patients. Most of the time we'd be able to deal with 2 patients as long as their injuries were minimal enough, but maybe those 2 patients are, you know, not okay to be in the same ambulance, whether it's personality issues or maybe their injuries are too extensive. So you would want to call additional resources. Additional resources is anybody extra that you want on scene. When we're working together with law enforcement and fire department, it does get divvied up a little bit whose responsibility it is to call certain resources. Like if we want a medical helicopter, it's our responsibility to get that ball rolling. We are the ones that are going to call dispatch and say, hey, we want a helicopter. Or we'll tell a firefighter, hey, we want a helicopter, call them. Things like maybe a coroner is necessary on scene. Usually that's law enforcement that would call. If it's a hazardous scene, like a hazmat materials type scene, usually it's the fire department that's going to call for that specialized team. But it just depends on where you're at and who's doing what and so on. So that was the end of this chapter. Again, we've got 2 more chapters to do this week.